I want to share with you a little bit about, I'll give you some context for me, what my sphere of influence has looked like and currently looks like. And then I want to just unpack a little bit about what the Word says and hopefully equip us to, when we go out of here, just to be a little bit more ready for what our week may hold, and to be in a really strong position to use the influence that God has given us in the best way possible to see his kingdom extended. So is that okay? Are we ready? Yeah. Great. I won't give you my whole work history and stuff like that, but more recently, kind of probably over the last 10 years or so, I've had the privilege, I've worked for church, but in a business context. I worked for a church that had a very large building. I was involved in the build process of that and then getting it up and running. And it operated as a commercial business as well. Lots of venue hire. There was a coffee shop, a children's nursery. So I worked for a church, but I wasn't doing what most people would traditionally think is church work. I spent a lot of time in the sort of corporate world. And so for me, that understanding of how do we take what happens and how do we take our faith, but how to reflect that, it gave me a really good context, because I think the challenge sometimes can be, and you know, we've seen this, Julian and I, from working in a church, you can almost end up in a bubble. And it can happen to all of us in different spheres that we're in, spheres and bubbles, didn't mean to do that. But we can kind of forget the broader context of how the world works and how we're supposed to be light and salt and light in that world. So that's what I'd kind of been doing. And but for each of us, our sphere of influence can look very different. Johnny's touched on some of what that looks like, and he mentioned social media as well, which I had in my notes, because I think that's a whole topic all of its own. So many people say, "Oh, I don't really have a big sphere of influence. I don't have a lot of people that I rub shoulders with Monday to Friday." If you are on social media, Facebook, Instagram. It's not Twitter anymore, is it? Is it X or something like that? Anyway, I'm not on Twitter. But your reach, your sphere of influence is broader than you think. So that's an encouragement, but it's also a slight caution there. Can I say, I'm very conscious that this is being recorded now. When we put stuff out there, you can tell what your influence is like, because you might put a vague comment out there and you can guarantee somebody will reply, "What's up, hon?" You're influencing, people are listening to what you're saying. So I think for us, let's be very mindful of that, and steward what we're given well. But it can be anybody, your neighbours, your window cleaner, the people that you stand at the school gates with, your work colleagues, the university, all of that stuff. You know, neighbours, I think it's a really interesting one. Somebody actually preached a word a while ago. I found it really challenging, because I can't remember what they were preaching about, but the one bit often there's a line that stands out, and what they were saying is, they said, if somebody asked your neighbours about you, what would they say? And it's kind of funny, but it's not, because actually, isn't that really important? Your neighbours are part of your sphere of influence. Would they say, "Oh, they're the ones, they never bring their bin in on time. Front garden's a mess. They let their cat or their dog pee all over everybody else's lawns," all of that stuff. What would our neighbours say about us? How are we influencing them? I didn't say that one in the first service, but I'll just leave that there. I don't know. Part of the preach that I had, it was challenging us to actually be the kind of neighbours that somebody would say, "Oh, it's great living next door to them. They're great neighbours." To be honest, in our street, you're a great neighbour if you're the one that knows which bin is supposed to go out that week. That's like the eternal quiz every week. You're looking out, and there's always somebody in the street who decided to mess with everybody's mind and put the wrong bin out. And then there's a standoff to see, are they right or is everyone else right? Anyway, we'll get into the Word. In the Word, actually, God gives us some clear instructions all throughout the Bible. There is instruction on how we're to live in the best way, not just for our lives to flourish, but then for our influence on others to be what it should be. And Paul talks about this. He talks about his sphere of influence in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 22. And he says this, he says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. And to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. And that sums up how Paul lived his life. But before I go into what that scripture, I believe, is saying to us and what Paul is imparting to us, I want to just clarify what he's not saying. Because he's not saying that he is going to do absolutely anything and go and live like certain circles of people are living in order to influence them. No, he has some very clear boundaries. He's not saying that he's going to commit sin. He's not saying that he's going to compromise his beliefs. He's very clear in saying that actually, I'm not outside the law of God and I'm under the law of Christ. So he's retaining that boundary. But what he is saying is that beyond that, he will do all that he can in how he lives and how he interacts to accommodate and to be accommodating to each person that he meets in order to minimize any barriers to their openness to receive Christ. What he's saying is, I don't want to get in the way of somebody being able to clearly see Christ in me and receive Christ. I'll do all that I can to be accommodating to them, to be mindful of them, to meet them where they're at in order that I might win some. And, it's a challenge as to how we do that, what that looks like for us. He's talking about to the Jews and the non-Jews. That's not a context that for us here in Sunderland is something that we live by. But what about all the different areas? How do I become like my neighbours in order that I may reach my neighbours? How do I become like my work colleagues in order that I may reach them without stepping out from under the law of Christ and living in a way that compromises my beliefs and who I believe I am? How do we do that? What does it look like? For me, I've mentioned I was part of a build project, and one of the challenges that the church had identified this site. It was in the middle of a business park and wanted to build a very large building on there. And obviously it was the church that was behind it all, but it was a business centre that they were building that was going to have kind of multi-use. Slight challenge that they had was that the land was owned by the local council. And the council really weren't keen on selling a plot of prime business land to a church. They didn't understand what it was that the church wanted to do, but there was somebody within the council who knew me, but the people in the council didn't know that person knew me. And so they'd actually reported back that one comment that had been made informally in the discussion as to whether this plot of land should be sold to the church to develop, the comment was something along the lines of, oh, they'll just build a big building and everybody will sit around singing Kumbaya in Jesus sandals with guitars. I mean, this wasn't that long ago. I mean, fair enough saying that, 30 years ago, 35 years ago? But this was only 15 years ago. And so it was clear that there was some barriers there in being able to influence and to reach those guys in the council and for them to understand what we were doing. The incredible thing is that actually through various ways, God actually turned that situation around. The land was sold to the church with the comment. It was actually in writing. It was in the body of an email that's sent to confirm, yes, we will sell the land to the church. It was because we cannot find a reason to not sell it to the church. That's great, isn't it? I love it when God does that. But because of that whole journey, other church leaders would come and have a look around the building and check it out, and they would ask, how have you done what you've done? There was a particular church who were struggling themselves with getting all the planning permissions and that they needed from the council. And one of the guys there was chatting and he said, we're going in. He's like, we are who we are. I go in my ripped jeans and my leather jacket, and we're kind of disruptors, and we're struggling to get what we want, but you know what? We're not going to give up. And whilst on one hand that might sound quite okay and kind of noble in one sense, I'm not going to change who I am to fit in with you, but then that's not what Paul said, is it? Paul actually said, in some areas I will change how I am in order to fit in with you, in order that I may actually win some. So when they asked us what we'd done, I very gently shared our story, and just kind of very kindly explained, actually we kind of took the opposite approach. When we had meetings with the council, I dressed like I was having a meeting with the council. I kind of, I had trouser suits and all of that stuff, you know. But I dressed to fit in. I was trying to remove as many barriers as possible. And actually, when we went in and sat with the council and explained what we wanted to do, we weren't all bullheaded and saying, we want to do this no matter what. We actually asked the question, hey, this is what we want to do, but how does what we would like to do, how can we shape that perhaps to meet some of the vision and some of the needs that you, how can we serve you? How can we help the council in what we want to do? And it was amazing that in actually almost trying to become more like them and serve part of their vision without compromising our own, but we found favor and that influence worked. And that the very people who sat and begrudgingly sold the land and gave the planning permission within 18 months actually became probably one of the key reasons that the success of the business element of what we did there took off at such a rate, because they became key supporters and opened doors. They're the ones that invited Hitachi to come and look around the building when they were building the train factory, and then they ended up using space in the building for 3 years, still even using it to this day in some contexts. And so actually what we thought was going to be really difficult and was difficult, by actually listening to God and saying, God, give us your wisdom in this, he turned it around. And hey, I'd love to say that they then all came into church and became Christians and them and their families are worshipping God. They're not yet. But they now know that churches aren't full of people wearing Jesus sandals and singing Kumbaya. They're actually full of people who have integrity, who can be trusted, who are faithful with what they're given, and are people that they want in their circle. And I'm sharing that because I want to encourage you that we sometimes can make it more difficult for ourselves than it needs to be. Sometimes we can think that, the devil's really on at me in this, he's really in this situation. But actually, sometimes God's given us some of the tools to make it a little bit easier for ourselves, or to be able to actually open doors and to have those kind of relationships that then we can influence for good and we can share our faith in an easier way. I was saying in the first service, and I'll share now, it's very timely, it's at Halloween. And I am not about to try and get into a theological debate about Halloween. If you want that debate, you can go and talk to anyone except me. That's not my gift, that's not what I'm standing up here to say. But over the years, Halloween has changed, whether it's something that you've happily celebrated with your kids or not. As a kid, I was never allowed to do anything, although we were allowed to carve things, but it wasn't pumpkins. The kids have it so easy these days because we carved turnips, and those things were flipping hard work. And they smelt really weird, and I still don't know why we carved turnips. My parents would never celebrate Halloween, and yet we carved turnips. Anyway, we would do that, but we never kind of celebrated anything like that. In fact, I think there was even maybe it's a sign taped on the door, like, please do not knock here, we don't celebrate. Anyway, I'm not judging, but for us, when we then had our kids, there was an element, they didn't go to the Halloween discos at school and all of that stuff. Now, I know culturally there's been quite a shift. There's a lot of American influence over how Halloween now is approached here in the UK. Aside from the spiritual stuff and the theological debate around it, Julian and I actually made a decision when we moved house and we moved into a new build estate, and it was a lot of young families. It was when our girls were a bit younger. And we realized that if we were the house that when people with their kids dressed up in superhero outfits or whatever came knocking on doors, there was a chance that we were going to get known as the weird family that didn't answer the door or didn't, they never have any sweets for kids. Now, like I said, you have to find peace with yourself on how you approach this. But for us, we figured that that was at risk of becoming a barrier with our neighbours in us being able to reach them. So we're not compromising our Christian faith, we're not compromising our beliefs in actually just having a bowl of sweets by the door that when they knock on the door, they can take a bag of sweets. For us, it helped. It was one of those areas of like, we're gonna break some barriers down here. I'm gonna become a bit more like my neighbours in this without compromising ourselves, but in order that I may reach them. And so that's what I think for each of us, we have to work out what that looks like for us and understand where are the areas that are the non-negotiables for us, But what are the areas where there's a bit of margin and a bit of flexibility? And what are some of the things that actually we could, when I say compromise on, I don't mean compromise spiritually, but I mean just in maybe some of our habits or behaviors, or there's some things that we're doing even unintentionally that are forming barriers and making it harder for us to influence people that God's put in our world for good. There's a quote that says, "Preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary." And probably up until preparing this preach, I've probably used it in other preachers as kind of, that's a great quote, and nod and kind of go amen to that. And it was in discovering that it was wrongly attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. It's often quoted as their quote. But actually, scholars who looked at what was actually said have said the context is actually a little broader than that. It's not that you preach the gospel at all times and then, if necessary, use words. It's basically saying let your actions speak for themselves. And then use words if necessary, which almost means as long as you're behaving that way, it doesn't really matter what you say. But I don't think that's quite what it's saying. And when you look at the context, what it's saying is that in our efforts to share our gospel in our worlds, if all it is actions, but there are no words, that can lead to confusion, because there's no explanation as to why we're doing what we're doing, what the heart behind it is. What then sets us apart in running a community hub that is no different necessarily to a really good toddler group that's down the road. There's got to be then some words alongside that to then give context to what we're doing. So actions without words can lead to a bit of confusion. But then if we're all words but no actions, that leads to what a lot of you maybe have heard said about church, that, oh, those Christians, they're hypocrites. What they're basically saying is they say one thing but they do another, or they say one thing but we never see it backed up by any actions. And so we don't want to have mistrust. We don't want to be all talk and have no substance then to back that up, because it's, in Corinthians it says, if I have all of these different things, if I speak eloquently and all the rest of it, but I have not love, which is, it's love in its demonstration, then I'm just like a resounding cymbal or a clanging gong. It's not pleasant. Sunderland needs more than a clanging gong. They need the evidence, the practical evidence of the love of God. What we need are actions and words aligned together, that gives us influence, and it's influence in the right way. So not only do we need to make sure that the words that are coming out of our mouth are right, but that our actions are backing them up. And yes, that's as church, that's as City Life Church, but that's as Karina, and as Julian, and Chris, and Geraldine. It's for us individually to be examining our hearts and saying, actually, how I'm living out, is it backing up what I would say when somebody asks me what's important to you, what's the priorities of your life, what's your faith? Would they know that, oh yeah, that makes sense now, because how I see them behave lines up with what they're saying? Challenging all of this then is, how do we do that? It's great for Paul to say, become all things to all men in order that I may win some. How do you do that? He's saying, I'm doing it without compromising my faith and my beliefs. But that's kind of, there's a moment of, certainly when I'm looking, I'm like, how do we do that well then? How can I stand here this morning and say something that is going to help you when you walk out of here today and you get up in the morning and you're thinking, right, I'm very conscious now of my sphere of influence. What can I say that will help you then to go, do you know what, I feel better equipped stepping out the door this morning, that I'm going to be able to live out my faith and influence that sphere in the right way without compromising my relationship with Jesus and who I am and all the values tied in with that. And so I've called this is kind of the body of the preach. This is the official preach bit. I've called it Rooted for Reach. And we're going to look at John 15, and it's a really simple scripture, and it's a really simple preach. I don't know about you, I quite like simple stuff because I tend to remember it a bit better. So we're going to just go through this, and there are 4 things in this verse that I'm going to just highlight and pull out that then hopefully you can then take into your week and be reminded of each day as we're all stepping out into the world that God's put us into. John 15, verse 5 says this. It says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So 4 things this verse tells us. Number 1, it says that we are to remain in him. Who's him? It's remaining in God, remaining in Christ. What that means is well, that sounds great, Karina, but how do I remain in him? What does that mean? I can't spend 7 days a week in church if it means being in here. It's not that. It's just meaning that every single day of our lives, we make a conscious decision to remain connected to him. We make sure that throughout our day, we are talking to God, we draw from him, we seek him, we cultivate that time with Jesus. As a church, it's already been mentioned this morning about the 90 days of transformation that we've been doing since the beginning of October. Reading through the New Testament together in those 90 days, along with making some intentional time to pray, to seek God. The whole purpose of this is to actually end the year strong in the context of having a deepening relationship with Jesus. What are we saying as church? We're saying we want to remain in him and strengthen that connection. It talks about a vine and branches. A branch that's loosely connected is going to struggle to bear fruit and to draw the nutrients from the vine that it needs. And what we're saying as church is actually by intentionally developing our discipleship journey with God, we're strengthening that connection with the vine. And we want to go deeper with him and remain strong in him. I want to encourage you, it's not too late. You know, we're 29 days into the 90 days. There's not some kind of magic line or kind of spiritual line. I shouldn't say magic, should I? I've already mentioned Halloween. I'm treading a really thin line there, aren't I? There's not some kind of spiritual boundary line that says you had to have started on the 1st of October, and if you don't end at the end of the year with everyone else, then that's it. It's been a waste of time. Not at all. You know what? You can start today. You can start tomorrow, and it doesn't matter that it ends in the new year or if you want to catch up and kind of finish at the same time, but actually take your time, because the whole point is to develop that deeper relationship with Jesus. So it's not about speed reading a bit of the Bible. It's about actually taking time to let it sink in and understand what it is and deepen our discipleship in Jesus. It's not about a tick list saying I've ticked off those scriptures for today, I've done those chapters for the day, I've prayed that, I've read that, I've clicked on the link that Pastor Johnny sent and I've watched that extra bit of video or I've downloaded that bit of extra stuff. It's not about that. Those things help, but that's just transactional. That's just a checklist. That stuff's there for us to then use to actually deepen our relationship. This is about relational depth and strength. So the first thing the verse tells us to do is to remain in him. Second thing then is that as we remain in him, he remains in us. Of all 4, this is probably my favorite, because having talked about it in the first service and obviously preparing this preach, every time I get to this bit, there's more and more that comes out for me in what it means for him to remain in us. I didn't bring water up with me. Rookie mistake tonight. When he remains in us, what we receive from him are several things. We receive his identity. Thank you, dear. I didn't need a drink in the first service, so I thought I'd be all right. I'm like, no, I can do this. Obviously not. When he remains in us, what do we receive from him? We receive from God his identity. We become co-heirs with Christ. Just take a moment on that to think about what that really means. Jesus is the Son of God, and when we remain in him, when we remain connected to the vine, we then become adopted into that family. We share that same DNA, that same lifeblood. So we receive his identity. So everything that Jesus has access to from God, we do too. I mean, that's incredible. If you're making notes, write that in your notes, and then maybe take a bit of time later to think about, what does that actually mean for me? We receive his identity. We receive his heart. Oh, gosh. There was a song out, I wanted to say it was only about 5 years ago, but I'm sure it was probably It's a lot longer, isn't it? It's a really old one. I'm showing my age. There was a song we used to sing in church and there was a line in it that said, "Break my heart for what breaks yours." And it was one of those songs that actually, when you get to that bit, you kind of have to really be sure that you want to sing those words. Because asking God to break our heart for what breaks his, that's a dangerous prayer. Because it will change how you see everything. And when we remain in him and he remains in us, we receive his heart. Do you know what, church? When we walk out the doors, it changes how we see people. It changes how we see that obnoxious co-worker. It changes how we see that parent at the school gate who does not parent in a way that we would necessarily approve of and who talks in a way that doesn't fit with us or all of that stuff. It changes because when you've got God's heart in you, you see them from his perspective. And for us to receive his heart, it means that we are changed and that the spheres that we're in then, it's not just that old thing, I'm going to show my age again. You know the wristband, what would Jesus do? WWJD. I actually think as noble and it was a great kind of whatever it was, project, slogan, whatever. But I actually think there is what would Jesus do, but it's actually how does Jesus feel? And when we receive his heart, we feel what he feels, which means that we are led by him and his spirit, and we see things differently. It's not just what would he do, God would help that person. No, how would he feel? Because Jesus never just responded to somebody by throwing some money in their direction. He responded to them emotionally, and he healed and restored them, and he made relational connections. We're called to do the same. We receive his heart, and then, I think this is key, that then this is how we actually manage to walk in the fact that we receive his heart, is that we also receive his authority. So all the authority that Jesus had walking on the earth, that power, when we say that at the name of Jesus, every knee must bow, we receive that same authority as he remains in us. So we don't walk out scared. We're not nervous about what we may encounter in the course of a day, because we're going out with his authority in us. And he has equipped us then with everything that we need for every situation and circumstance we may come across. So we remain in him, he remains in us. And then thirdly, that scripture tells us that then the consequence of that is that we bear fruit. It's all good. Anybody want to bear fruit? Anybody want to be fruitful? There's a few people who don't. It's your call. Bit odd, but it's your call. Hey, when we talk about bearing fruit, we don't literally mean that suddenly you're going to start sprouting apples from your ears or anything like that. Can I just say that as a kid, when you're a kid growing up in church back in a long time ago, there are some things that get said that as a kid you take literally. And there was a lot of things that I had to unlearn as I grew up. Anyway, fruitfulness was one of them. When people said about, that you'll bear fruit, I was like, I don't want to. Maybe that's why some of you don't want to in the room today, because you're like, I don't know what that means. It just means that actually, when we're living our life out, we'll see good results from what we're doing. When we bear fruit, it means that it's not about success, but it can be about significance. We make a difference for good wherever we go. Awesome. The great thing about bearing fruit, though, is it's not reliant on us, because we bear fruit as a result of us remaining in him and then him remaining in us. So it's not through our striving, it's not through our kind of work or what we're trying to do. It comes through remaining. Why do we keep going on and on and on about the importance of discipleship and our relationship with Jesus? It's because everything comes from that. All the strength that you need, all the faith that you need, all the wisdom that you need, all the grace that you need, all the thankfulness that you need, it all comes from there. That's why it's so important. I tell you what, doing 2 in a row kind of takes it out of you. So we bear fruit. And it's that fruit that we're looking for in our spheres. I don't know about you, sometimes you can get frustrated thinking, is it really making a difference what I'm doing? But I want to encourage you that we we are just called to keep sowing the seed. I think it's Paul that says, I'm looking at the front row here, I'm looking for the people who know it. When Paul that says that I sow the seed and Apollos waters and all the rest of it, what that tells me is it's not all on me. I just do my part and keep on walking and trust that God knows exactly what that person next needs, and he will bring the right person along at the right time to do the right thing. So in all of that, the verse wraps up on a really positive note. After it says, if you remain in me and I in you, you'll bear much fruit. And then it, just to kind of affirm it, it wraps it up and says, because apart from me, you can do nothing. And I actually clicked on compare to look at all the different versions, because, when you're preaching, you're supposed to kind of delve into words. And I'm like, I wonder what else nothing, the Greek root and all of that stuff and all of that. It actually means nothing. There is no variation on that. There's no one that says, it actually meant something. But no, it means nothing. And it doesn't mean that you can't get through life without Jesus. What it means is that that's as much as you'll get. There is nothing of eternal significance that can be done outside of remaining in Jesus. You want your life to count for something? Remain in Jesus. Get in a relationship with Jesus. Say to him, do you know what, God? I surrender my life to you. I want to live out under your plans and purposes, make you the Lord of my life, because I understand that only what I do for you and through you will last. Our days on earth are numbered, but the things that we do that are of eternal significance carry with us for eternity. I think sometimes the challenge can be, and I know I've done this, is we can look around and we see people who are really, not even subtly, but really blatantly not living lives that are planted in Jesus, that remaining in him and him remaining in them, and yet they appear to be fruitful. And I call this the cut flower syndrome. A vase of flowers can look beautiful and it can look really fruitful and blooming and full of life. But the reality is that labeling up a bunch of flowers in a shop as fresh flowers is actually a lie. Then they're freshly cut, but they're not fresh flowers, because the moment they were cut off from the root that they were attached to, they're dying. And somebody's life can look fantastic externally, but the reality is if it's not rooted in Jesus and they're not connected to the vine, then it's an illusion. And come back in a few days or a few weeks, depending on where you get the flowers from. I said in the first service that M&S tend, for some reason, I don't know what they do, but they tend to last longer. Someone said to me in the break, actually, Aldi are just as good. So I don't want to be seen as favouring a brand. But you come back and eventually those flowers will die. They don't last forever. You can do all the tricks, a 2p piece in the water for tulips, apparently, or all these different potions that you can put in. But you're just extending the inevitable, that there is no life source left in those flowers. That's not how our lives are designed to be. We're designed to be connected to the life source and to remain in him. So don't get distracted by somebody else's life looking more fruitful than you think yours is. That's their journey, that's their story. We resist that comparison because for each of us, it's about our relationship with Jesus and remaining rooted in him. Not just so that our lives are successful, but because we're rooted for reach. There's a purpose behind it all. We don't exist as City Life Church just so we can all gather in here on a Sunday and have a great time together and worship God, which is amazing, and then go out and then just wait to come back again next Sunday. As great as it is to gather, and that is part of what we do, but there's a reason behind it. It's so that as people of God, we are equipped and encouraged and discipled to then go out. This is for a purpose, to then go out into the world, with all the people that we rub shoulders with, and be an influence for good in their lives, and to just help move them into that journey of meeting Jesus and experiencing Jesus for themselves. I don't know about you. I want my life to count for something. And I want people, after they've encountered me, to walk away feeling better than before. There are some people in the world that you can rub shoulders with and you come away thinking like, I need a cup of tea now. They drain you. I don't want any of us to be like that. People should rub shoulders with us. The people who are in our spheres of influence should think it's a good day when we're in the office. that it's been a good morning when they've bumped into us at the school gate and they miss us when we're not there, that people in our unis know that if they're struggling, if you're around, you're a good person to talk to. Our world should be better because we're in it. But the only way that we can do that is if we remain in him and allow him to remain in us. And I'm going to wrap up. As I said, my father-in-law was a Methodist minister, so he would love this. I'm sure he's quoted it many times. John Wesley said this in one of his preachers. He said, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can." Let that be part of what our approach is to life, to do all that we can, whenever, wherever, whoever we can. Like Paul says, in order that we may win some.